When animating 3D characters, we often have to place them in some kind of an environment. And the more we can integrate the character into its environment, the better the effect and the shot will look. In this ICE tutorial, we're going to create two separate effects that place the character more firmly in its environment. We'll be creating footprints, which ironically happens to be one of the first compounds that was embedded inside of the XSI menus when ICE was created. And we're also going to create the effect of dust coming off of the ground as the character interacts with it. So for each step, we create a footprint and a little dust plume that dissipates very quickly. So to start this effect, we need to bring in a model. And I've already got the advanced rig model dragged and dropped into my scene from the models folder of my XSI 7 training project. So open your browser, find the Mulcore advanced rig, and drag and drop to begin. We also need something for Mulcore to interact with, and for that I'm going to use a ground plane. I'll get a primitive polygon grid, and I'll expand it so that we have a long runway to work with. Again, the idea when you're making these kind of effects is to use any object to create the interaction, but realize that ICE can also move that effect over to any other object. That's the power of ICE, being able to prototype on something simple and then move the effect over to something that's a little more complex. So we're using a grid for simplicity. I'm going to take the length and stretch it out slightly, maybe to a value of about 60 or so, and I'll increase the number of subdivisions. For the deformation effect that we're going to create, it's dependent on having enough subdivisions in your ground plane to make the effect look believable. So I'm going to increase the subdivisions to something pretty large, maybe 100 by 100. Let's make it still a little bit larger. And again, the idea here is to have more or less a square shape. Okay, I think that should be good enough. Again, the way ICE is built, we can always increase the number of subdivisions at any time. So to begin this effect, we'll start off by creating a point cloud. And we'll create an empty point cloud. We're going to actually create the dust effect to start off with. So we're going to create it from scratch by opening up an ice tree. And because this is an animated effect, we're going to want to create a simulated ice tree on my object, where the previous frame passes its information to the next frame. So this is essentially a particle system. So I create my ice tree port, the terminal port, and I'm going to open up the Show Hide Explorer to show that the ice tree operator sits in the simulation stack. Next, we need to build our functionality. And for this particular effect, we're going to look at creating an emission based on the interaction of two objects. If I look under the emitters, tasks, particles, we can emit blasts, emit from curve, null, position, surface, volume, in place, or we can emit a splash from a surface collision. Now, this would be the closest emission type that I would need to create this effect. I can also create a trail at surface interaction, but that would be more useful if you were doing, say, a tire interacting with a surface, or a shoe that might leave a scuff mark on a surface. So instead I'm going to use the emit splash from surface collision. I'll drag it into my graph, and of course it's not going to be resolved, so it shows up red. The emit splash will serve as the first input into my ice tree. And again, anytime you need to deal with any kind of emission over time, we'd want to also use a Simulate Particles node. So I'll look for my Simulate Particles node. I can look at under Tools, Simulation, and Simulate Particles. Again, I'm going to add this to my favorites folder because I tend to use Simulate Particles quite a bit. And I'll drag and drop the Simulate Particles node into my graph and plug in. Now, we don't actually have any objects resolving the compound yet. We need to specify both an emitter object, so this would represent the ground, and we have a splash object. So the splash object would represent the feet in this case. And I don't really want to use the entire Mulcore character as an emitter, so I'm going to use a little bit of a cheat here. I'm still going to use the foot-shaped object, but what I am going to do is just extract some polygons from the foot area so I don't have to deal with the entire mesh. So I'm going to go to my geometry group, make it selectable, and select some polygons from the lower section of the leg. So I'll access polygon mode by pressing Y, and I'll select these polygons about here. Again, I don't even need to select polygons that high. It's the bottom of the foot that's going to create the interaction. So the less polygons, the better in this case. I'll actually just use a smaller section. Let's say something like that. I can use the grow and shrink particles, Shift plus, Shift minus, to restrict my selection as well. I'll just manually go in and deselect some of the polygons that I don't need to be part of the effect. And I could keep going, but I'm just going to stop right about here. I don't really need to be totally accurate. I already have a pretty optimized number of polygons. Again, I could remove these ones off the toe. I'm just going to jump into an extended component selection so I can just middle mouse click to deselect polygons that I don't need involved. Alright, so I'm just going a little bit further here. Make sure I get some of the polygons on the toe out of that equation. And across the top of the character's opposite foot, do the same thing. Okay. A couple more polygons to go. And on the little pinky toe. Alright, that should work pretty well. I'm going to extract those polygons. I'm going to move back to the model window. I'm going to create a brand new poly mesh, and I'm going to extract the polygons, but instead of deleting the underlying originals, I'm going to keep the underlying originals. And what this is going to do for me is create a separate poly mesh object, which I'm going to call I should call it feet bottom, not fot. And if we look in the operator stack, we can see that we have an extract polygons operator that connects the extracted polygons to the object that they were extracted from. I'm going to drag the feet bottoms into my graph, and they're going to represent the splash geometry. So I'm going to plug their value into the splash geometry input. And as for my ground plane, the grid, which I will rename to ground, I'm going to use the ground as my emitter object. So at this point, the compound is resolved, and we can move on.